This is the Reading with Rochelle podcast, where we will explore history we never learned in school but wish we had. I'm Rochelle Chase, and this week's book is Medicine, Science, and Making Race in Civil War America by Leslie Schwalm. In this week's episode, we discuss Leslie's book and how the North helped anti-Black racism and white people's belief of Black inferiority beyond the Civil War and into today. This was accomplished by white medical and scientific professionals who used the Civil War as a laboratory and used Black enlisted men and those escaping slavery as objects of study to try to prove that African Americans were medically, biologically, and intellectually inferior, all while providing them with substandard health care. We discuss how, as it states on the back of the book cover, this mistreatment of Black soldiers and civilians extended after life to include dissection, dismemberment, and disposal of the Black war dead in unmarked or mass graves and medical waste pits. Simultaneously, white medical and scientific investigators enhanced their professional standing by establishing their authority on the science of racial difference and hierarchy. We also discuss the role that the U.S. Sanitary Commission and the Army Medical Museum play in this, and more. Here's a little bit about my guest. Leslie Schwalm is a professor emeritus of history in gender, women's, and sexuality studies at the University of Iowa. Leslie writes and lectures on how the wartime destruction of slavery shaped the lives of Black and white Americans, North and South. In addition to medical science and the making of race in Civil War America, Leslie's other books are A Hard Fight for We, Women's Transition from Slavery to Freedom in South Carolina, and Emancipation's Diaspora, The Politics of Race and Reconstruction in the Upper Midwest. Let's dive right into the discussion. So I wanted to start off with, in the preface of your book, you had mentioned that you were researching an earlier book when you learned about the medical mistreatment of the soldiers that were in Iowa's Black Regiment, which then, of course, led you to some archives and more information. But what was it that really made you say, this is an important story? I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop going in this direction. I'm going to work on this book. What was it that made you make that shift?
Well, two things. One was just what I thought was just the really despicable medical mistreatment of the Iowa men, Black men who had enlisted. But secondly, the sort of recent wave of history of Civil War medicine that was very praiseworthy of medical discoveries and the advance of medical knowledge during the war. And I really thought that was a very incomplete picture that lacked the perspective of how medical racism shaped people's experience of the war and the consequences of that emphasis on medical racism during the war. So I was drawn to the archive, but I was also responding to what I thought was an incomplete picture that was coming from fellow scholars in the field.
And living in Iowa, I am curious to know, I don't know if you call that out in your book, anything specific about the Iowa Regiment, but I was curious, what did you find? What kinds of things?
I found many men in the Iowa Regiment were vaccinated with contaminated vaccine matter that led to very serious infections and illness, and it spread sexually transmitted disease because some of that was from someone who had a syphilis infection. And so that then was spread not just to the men in the regiment, right, but to their partners and their wives, and thereafter to their children. But the men describe in their applications for pension benefits the impact of those infections, swollen arms and ulcers, and it was really disturbing.
Mm-hmm. Well, I could see that. So I want to take a step back and go back to your title for those who haven't read the book just yet. When we talk about medicine, science, and the making of race in Civil War America, can you briefly tell people what the book is about?
The book is about how white medical men associated with the Army, but also civilians, used the Civil War as an opportunity to advance their ideas that race was biologically embodied in human forms. And it's a story that really hasn't been well told about how invested white medical and scientific professionals were in proving the embodiment of race, but also in ensuring a common knowledge of white superiority and Black inferiority. So what I find is that the Civil War becomes kind of a laboratory, which white professionals were very eager to take advantage of in this endeavor that had gone on before the war. But the war, in large part because of the enlistment of, nearly 200,000 Black men into the armed services, the war provided an opportunity and an access to Black bodies that white medical professionals had not enjoyed previously.
And when you're talking about northern whites, you expressly call that out. Who are we talking about? I don't mean individual people, but what groups, what organizations, who are we talking about when we talk about northern whites?
Well, we're talking about, first of all, physicians and medical scientists. That is, that realm of what is medicine versus what is science was more overlapping at the time. And in the 1860s, medicine was just being professionalized. So people were establishing medical societies. They were trying to set boundaries. This kind of medical science is accurate and this kind is not. So there are all these kind of battles about who was a medical professional and who belonged and who did not. And the war becomes kind of, again, a place where this is accelerated and worked out. So we're talking about men who went to medical school, went to medical colleges, were practicing physicians before the war, and during the war saw an opportunity to serve either as enlisted surgeons to regiments or as civilians became involved in what was the largest civilian war relief organization during the Civil War. It was called the United States Sanitary Commission. So it was mostly medical professionals, but there were also a great many scientific professionals who were interested in a whole range of what we might consider to be anthropology today. So how humans develop, what humans look like in the past, what the ideal human shape looks like, etc. So these were elite white men because during the war, white women who were trained in medicine were not welcome into the Army.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about the U.S. Sanitary Commission, or the USSC, as you call it. What exactly? I had never heard of that organization before reading your book. Can you talk a little bit about what that was, how it started?
Certainly. This was a huge organization. I cannot overemphasize how large this was. Tens of thousands of local communities organized relief societies during the war. They wanted to support their soldiers, their regiments, the Union Army in general. So initially, this is an organization that is dreamed up by a white woman physician who had organized a hospital. So she had management experience, and she saw the outbreak of war as needing the support of local societies who could raise money, who could prepare food, who could sew items, who could do everything they could to support the war effort. So she holds some meetings. This is in New York City, and arranges with some male colleagues to go to Washington, D.C. and talk to the Secretary of War about their vision for this organization that would support the war effort. Again, remember, this war is conducted on a scale that the nation had never seen. neither the Union nor the Confederacy were prepared to outfit a large army. They were not prepared to care for that army, whether through disease or wounds. So it was really a huge undertaking. So Elizabeth Blackwell sends these male colleagues to D.C., and the male colleagues, as they see troops stationed around D.C., they decide they have a better idea for what this organization should be. And they pitch their organization to the Army officials. And indeed, it is their organization which then forms. They take charge, they take leadership, they hold the paid leadership positions. And women, in essence, white women become the agents of local organization. So without the women, we wouldn't have had the USSC. They become responsible for the tens of thousands of very locally organized societies who raise over millions of dollars and goods and organize ways to ship these south. They raise funds to help build hospitals. They do an incredible amount of work, again, to support an army that really there was no infrastructure to do all the things that have to be done in a time of war. And the Sanitary Commission does great work during the war. They do help the Army develop a way of constructing effective hospitals, and they help keep track of who's in what hospital and what their state is. And they provide all sorts of dietary assistance to soldiers in hospitals. They do accomplish a great deal. But the men were most interested in scientific and medical research during the war. They felt that was more important than the relief that women were organizing. And so there was kind of this struggle between the women who wanted to organize people and raise money, and the men who wanted to do medical and scientific research and who wanted to publish it and become known as published authors of this kind of professional level of research.
So if we look at these two kind of parts of this, the kind of the different roles between what the women were doing and then what the men were doing, if we start with the women, I think in the book you were pointing out that there was also, though, this, again, you're supporting this war effort that is freeing enslaved people. But you've got the women who are saying, well, no, we don't want to help the Black soldiers. We don't want to give money to the Black civilians. We don't want the Black women that have their own relief organizations to participate in this. But we don't mind asking them for their money, but we don't want them to participate in this. So you did have that going on, right? With the
right. And what becomes, I think, I think this is one of the things that contribute to what we understand about the Civil War is that white women and white men use the Sanitary Commission to elevate themselves as a new kind of citizen who could organize and manage and represent and exclude African American men and women from that work. So they claimed a new kind of white citizenship during this war that ultimately ends slavery. So I feel like it's a really important thing to grapple with, that ending slavery does not in any way end white notions of white superiority and Black inferiority. And in fact, it becomes a venue where those ideas were expanded on and more deeply embedded in American culture. So I think, unfortunately, a lot of people have the idea that since the North ultimately adopted the end of slavery as a war goal, that must have undermined anti-Black racism, when in fact it became a moment to expand on it and elaborate on it for white folks.
Yeah, and that was something that is evident all throughout, I think, this book. If we talk about the men, and you said they're focusing on kind of that collection of data and wanting that first part of collecting data. We're coming into this. We see that these white men are coming in with these ideas that are already racist in nature, be it polygenesis or these different thoughts. And so it's almost like this research is being used to further support the beliefs that people already came in with. Would that be a good assumption?
It's very clear from the archives that these medical and scientific professionals were not asking themselves, does race exist? Does it even exist? Is it real? Or are we commonly human? Instead, they go into this research with questions and driving ideas that were, how can we prove and demonstrate white superiority and Black inferiority?
Mm-hmm. Let's look at some of because some of the things that were being collected. When you looked at, it wasn't just the Black men that data was being collected on. So when you look at, I think you said something like 8,000 white men they were collecting the initial data on this. What was the purpose, first of all, when we look at the white soldiers, what were they trying to collect? What was the purpose of that data collection?
The purpose was to establish kind of what does the average human body look like. If we were to say this idea of a numerical average was actually kind of a new concept that was being explored and thought about, the mathematical tools that allowed us to gather a lot of data and analyze it, again, without computers or calculators. This was kind of a new endeavor. And the idea that American scientists and medical professionals could have access to thousands of men's bodies that they could measure and weigh and test their strength and test their lung capacity seemed to these leaders as an important opportunity to gather data. Initially, right, Black men weren't being enlisted into the Army, and there were only white soldiers to measure. So when this endeavor begins, it is simply, again, trying to aggregate data at a scale that had never been done. But then Black soldiers begin to be enlisted in the summer and fall of 1863. And it is almost a year before the Sanitary Commission's newly employed director of this project says, why haven't you looked at Black soldiers? Why haven't we measured them? And there was an incredible shift of attention and resources now than after the enlistment of Black men to measure as many Black soldiers as possible.
But when we're talking about measurement, I think you said African Americans in good and ill health were subjected to investigation, measurement, and speculation. Their severed limbs, tumors, bones, blood, and tissues were photographed, sketched, and taken as specimens. Their cadavers were autopsied. Their skulls were cleaned and collected. All of this. So you go, their brains are weighed, lungs are weighed, all to substantiate the whites' belief that people of African descent constituted an indisputably inferior race with physiological and moral peculiarities that could be revealed using the modern and modernizing techniques of medical science. So it seemed like there was this shift now. Not only are we looking at Black men, we're starting to look at them, but we're looking at them differently.
Yes. So there were two different kind of endeavors, one by the Sanitary Commission to measure living people. The other endeavor was by the Army, which established very early in the war a medical museum. And its intent was to document this first modern war in American history and the medical consequences of modern warfare. And so very early in the war, the Army circulates an order to military surgeons and say, send us specimens, send us bones, send us artifacts, label them, preserve them in barrels of whiskey, and we will pay the shipping to the museum where we will create specimens. We will catalog them and create specimens and then mount them in the museum for study. So the museum was understood to be kind of a lab, but also for the public to appreciate. And it, in fact, becomes an important tourist destination in the 1870s after the war. So in pursuit of documenting the so-called medical consequences of modern warfare, there is a great effort to collect these specimens, not just specimens from African Americans. And in fact, there was more interest in gathering specimens from white soldiers. And I speculate that this is because they were viewed as representative of humanity, whereas specimens from African Americans, we might assume, were used to indicate blackness and only blackness and not humanity. But what's interesting, and this is a part of the illogic of American racism, what's interesting is that in those collections and the catalogs of those collections, specimens from Black people were very often used as representatives of humanity. So there's this slipperiness of the logic of racism where sometimes Black bodies are used by whites to say this is how Black people are different and how Black humanity is different. But sometimes whites use Black bodies as representatives of humanity. So that was contradictory. And it was evident even in the collections of the museum itself, because the museum also aspired to having the largest collection of the skulls of deceased Black people in the country. They saw that as an important goal, and they saw it as a way to document that people of African descent had smaller skulls, and they believed, therefore, smaller and inferior brains. Now, modern science today, we know that's not true. The size of brain is not correlated to intelligence, and so that's nonsense. But at the time, they believed it was a way of documenting white superiority. So the museum was an entirely sort of separate endeavor from the Sanitary Commission's drive to measure every aspect of the living human body. The Army was much more interested in what destruction, disease, and warfare could do to the human body. But both end up, really emphasizing race as kind of a critical part of how medicine is understood and how the human body is understood.
Let's switch to these are men that are alive, but then you also devote a large section of the book talking about Black bodies, literally, people that are dead, and the dissection that's going on. And the way you are talking about so many of these physicians that are not only using dissection as a way to practice, because you've got so many Black bodies, and these are things that white people are not okay with, this desecration of the body. But there's this feeling that, well, we can do this to Black bodies, so let's go ahead and take advantage of this opportunity. So you've got those that are doing the dissection, but then you've also got those that seem like it's this rush to send all of these parts to the museum to catalog and say, again, to get your name and get recognition in the museum. Can you speak a little bit about that? And
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for raising that. That's another important part of the book. Again, a disturbing part of the research that I did. And I just want to start out by explaining to maybe a lay audience that dissection was regarded on the eve of the war as the primary way one learned anatomy. So it was a highly valued part of medical training, but it was also challenging because it was difficult to get cadavers. People didn't want their dead desecrated, and so there was a trade in cadavers before the war. Sometimes these were the bodies of formerly enslaved people that were shipped to northern medical colleges. Other times people would engage in grave robbing, particularly the cemeteries where poor people were buried and where African Americans had built their own cemeteries. So these were particularly vulnerable people. As physicians wanted to gain this important, valuable skill of knowing how to open the human body and identify the parts and learn about the human body. So it was the gold standard, but it was difficult to attain because cadavers were few and far between. So then we have this Civil War where 800,000 people die. And so we have a sudden availability of cadavers for use by medical professionals and aspiring medical professionals. And what we see is the exploitation of both dead soldiers' bodies and Black civilians' bodies following their death. In terms of soldiers, one of the examples I explain in the book, there was a white medical professional who had various positions in the Army during the war, including supervising hospitals. And at one point, he was supervising the big hospital in St. Louis, where Black troops were organized, Black regiments were organized and made their way further south from this St. Louis location. And this physician, Russell, was interesting because in many ways he resisted medical racism within the Army. He wrote about it. He protested the mistreatment of Black soldiers in the hospital. And he appeared to be a defender of Black soldiers and racial equality. But he also conducted postmortem dissections of at least 800 Black soldiers who had been hospitalized in St. Louis. Over 800 Black bodies. Now, he had access to far more white cadavers than Black, because Black soldiers were a small proportion of the enlisted men in the Union Army. So he chose to do his postmortem explorations only on Black soldiers, or predominantly Black soldiers. And he totally dissected them. I mean, he weighed their brains, he measured their colons, he measured their lungs. So, I mean, he was very much involved in this effort to prove that, again, race was embodied in every aspect of African American anatomy. Oh, I mean, that very fact that he was involved in that endeavor and yet seemed to be a defender of Black troops when they were living. The second part of that story that is so awful is that those men, those cadavers, never had official burials. We don't know where they ended up, but unlike white soldiers who were treated with some respect when it was possible in their burial, the bodies of these men never received official burials, no marked graves. It's impossible to locate them. So we suspect that their bodies ended up in medical waste pits. So that's really quite horrible. And this is just one example of one white physician in one hospital. So I can only assume that similar endeavors occurred, and I know they did in other hospitals under white surgeons. So that's one example. Another example, turning to Black civilians during the war, Washington, D.C., because of its location right near Maryland, a slaveholding state that does not secede during the war, and near Virginia, which of course did secede, both having large populations of enslaved people. During the war, enslaved people made their way to Washington, D.C., where slavery was abolished in the spring of 1862. So they made their way to D.C., both as a refuge from slavery, also as a refuge from the war itself. So oftentimes Union troops going through Maryland or Virginia would bring back refugees from slavery who would try to find shelter and a way to make a living in the nation's capital. We estimate about 40,000 men, women, and children who were refugees from slavery came into the city during the war. Creates a huge refugee population. There were camps, there were hospitals. The city had a very difficult time dealing with this population. And frankly, they were sick. They were ill. They were starved. They were malnourished. They didn't have appropriate shelter. They didn't have good medical care. And so they died. There was a very high mortality rate for these Black civilians. And when their friends and family brought them to the few hospitals that would treat them during the war, when they died, the medical workers felt entitled to use their cadavers for dissection, for autopsies. And hundreds of these refugees from slavery were treated in this way. And the physicians, the white physicians who carried on these autopsies and dissections, wrote up post-mortem reports and forwarded them to the Army Medical Museum, which is odd because the museum was supposed to be about how soldiers suffered during the war, but they collected these hundreds of postmortems on Black civilians. So that can only mean that the museum was also interested in, again, collecting data about the embodiment of race. And again, these cadavers were not treated to any kind of decent burial. When they went to the hospital, died there and were dissected. So there's considerable evidence of Black soldiers and Black civilians not receiving the kind of dignity and care in death that whites expected for themselves and their soldiers and their own civilian refugees.
Yeah, and I think you also made something that was also as telling when you said even the way the data was collected, they had some information about some of these people, but because they used it to catalog the remains and say, okay, here's what this person might have been suffering from. So they must have talked to family members, but yet and still they weren't recording names. Family members wouldn't necessarily even be told that their loved ones had died. They'd be listed as contraband. So again, there's this treating of these Black bodies as objects, even to family members, not even being sensitive and saying, hey, your loved one passed. We're not even going to tell you we're going to use the body. We're going to list it as we didn't know who this was and leave it at that.
That's right. That's right. And some of this was observed by the white and Black women who came to Washington to try and organize relief for these refugees. They worked in camps. They tried to help them find shelter, tried to help feed them, educate the children. And there is some correspondence from these women, again, Black and white, who said they had their suspicions that when people died in the camps, their bodies were taken away and mistreated in this way, rather than giving them and their surviving relatives a chance at closure and a dignified burial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think when we look at all of these various points that you've made, I went back to an earlier point that you had read at the beginning of, I think, one of the early chapters when you said, by turning our focus more specifically on how Northern whites' ideas about race mattered during and immediately after the Civil War, we might gain greater insight into how and why ideas about racial difference and inferiority survived slavery's destruction. So, in keeping with what we talked about, how would you respond to that hope? I mean, how would you summarize what we've talked about to say these ideas of supporting racial difference and inferiority survived slavery's destruction? But how would you answer that hope?
Yeah, well, so anti-Black racism's history in Western civilization is tied to slavery. It's a justification for slavery. It's a way to rationalize the exploitation and commodification of fellow humans. And we might hope that with the need for racism as a way to justify the practice of slavery and the buying and selling of people, we might hope then that the need for racism is gone and we can begin to grasp fellow humanity and be willing to think about that and accept that. But instead, what we have is an even more energetic commitment to the idea of Black inferiority, even when slavery is gone. And so it's a reminder that this energy and excitement comes from Northern whites, not from former slave owners, but from Northern whites who had already structured their society around this notion and their own identity around this notion of white supremacy. It was built into the laws of northern states. It was built into everyday experience and practice. So it shows a commitment to racism that now extends well beyond the practice of slavery. And its continuance after the war, in many ways, is fueled by this tremendous amount of research and recirculation of ideas about race. And it has a long life after the war. What was done during the war supports continued racist medicine and racist science well into the 20th century. And racism still pervades medical diagnosis, medical testing, the use of certain instruments. So, it has a long life, and it's a reminder to us that of how easily and how committed whites have become historically to this notion of race and to their own supposed difference and superiority.
I think that is something that really stood out I kept going back to kind of that question as I was reading the book, and I'm seeing again how all these people in the North are coming into this with these racist ideas. We've got these studies and such there and dissections and all this science that's now being done during and the war. And it's solidifying, in a sense, proving, now we're scientifically proving all these racist, I put that in air quotes, all these ideas that we came in with. And then we end with, like you said, these mountains of reports and papers and whatever that prove all this stuff that we can now refer to today, right?
Right. That's exactly right. And again, I want to say Black scientists and Black physicians resisted, protested. W.E.B. Du Bois did this incredible study of African Americans in Philadelphia, in part to refute this data that was collected during the war and presumed to be scientifically accurate. So I do want to make that point that there was considerable critique of this racist science.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, I guess I should clarify who the we was in that statement. I was really talking about white Americans or white doctors, I was really referring to that at that time. So you talked a little bit about some of the ways that this manifests itself today. Do you have some specific examples of some of those things you said? Like when you say what equipment is used or how it manifests itself in the healthcare industry, do you have some examples you can share?
Well, very brilliant and sadly recently deceased scholar, Lundy Brown, has done this extensive study on the spirometer, which is used to measure one's ability to breathe in and exhale forcefully. It's very important when you're testing people for asthma or for the impact of asbestos on breathing capacity. So it's tied to a lot of different diagnostics and also people's eligibility for redress if they've been injured in the workplace, etc. So the use of the spirometer continues by physicians to have something called race correction, which changes the reading of the data depending on the so-called race of the subject. And so even today, if you and I were to go in to get measured with a spirometer, they would use a different set of measurements for you, presuming you to have inferior lungs. And that's based in rationale about slavery. That's what that's based in. And many different kinds of diagnostics today use something called race correction, based on the presumption that different organs look different in white and Black bodies. And this gets fascinating in its contradictions because, of course, the medical professional makes guesses on who they think is white and who they think is Black based on appearance, right? Which you and I know does not tell us about people's heritage. So It is fascinating. And of course, there are pharmaceuticals that are being developed to target particular ethnic and racial groups. And the testing for those medicines are only done on members of those groups. So there's no comparative studies that allow us to see if, in fact, there are any kind of differences, because there won't be. So that's also, the pharmaceutical industry is capitalizing on this as well. So it permeates the practice of medicine. And it's also very evident in things like maternal mortality rate, how the care given to Black women in birth as opposed to white women, the attention given to infants, etc. Infant and maternal mortality rates. There's very deep distinctions here, and it has to do with their treatment by medical professionals, with people's treatment by medical professionals. So it does, racism, and I think we see it in the reluctance of some members of the Black community to go to white doctors, because there is a long and understood history of mistreatment, of pain, being underdiagnosed and undertreated, etc. Sorry, I could go on about this for a long time.
No. I think personally I've, experienced that. I know just going to like family doctor's appointments, and it's just hearing the medicine. Oh, this medicine, you need to just take this because it's good for Black people. It's, well, is that like an option? I mean, there's just this assumption that, yeah, you need to take this one. I've experienced the pain having surgery and given nothing but aspirin when I'm told that I literally just got out of the operating room, right? And I'm like, it hurts. It's like, nope, all I can give you is aspirin. I'm like, aspirin? So anyway, it's just, or a lot of people have some of those stories about that. What can we do? What can we do to change this? I mean, what kind of action can we take, either at an overall level or on an individual level?
One, I think, important move to make is to pay very close attention when state legislatures try to intervene in the history of teaching of history. And Iowa is unfortunately an example of this, where both in the public schools and in the universities, the state, both the Board of Education and the university regents, are trying to shape and censor the teaching of American history. So the material we've been talking about today would be viewed very suspiciously by many of the members of the Board of Regents. They don't want to see ideas about the history of American racism taught in schools because they say it makes white children feel bad. So until we understand our history of racism, its roots, and how it's been perpetuated, we're not going to understand how we got to where we are today. And instead, we're going to just think it's a natural thing, right? And rather than something created by people and sustained by people for particular purposes. So that's one thing, is to defend the teaching of good, accurate history, both in our public schools and in our universities. That's one thing. And to let our state legislators know that we're not going to settle for them banning books or intervening in a curriculum that helps our children come to terms with why racism exists today. That's one thing. The other thing is to demand our medical professionals treat us as humans and not as races or objects, right? And to listen carefully when Black men and women and Black children say, I was mistreated by this physician, or I deserve the dignity of equal treatment in the clinic. So those are a couple of things that I think are really, really important. I think addressing in particular this issue of maternal and infant mortality rate is extraordinarily important. So I think understanding the many ways in which anti-Black racism manifests itself today and understanding its historical roots, it's a part of what makes us American, and I think something we have to continue to grapple with.
Well, so tell the people that are listening, where can they find out more about you? Where can they purchase your book, Medicine, Science, and Making Race in Civil War America?
You can find the book in your libraries. You can ask your librarians to buy them at your public libraries. I love public libraries. You can find the book on Amazon. You can find it in your independent bookstore. Prairie Lights here in Iowa City carries the book. So it can be found there. I do have my own website.com that shows some of my other work I've done and has some links to some of the other projects I've been involved in. Like you, I have a deep interest in Black history in Iowa, and I've done some other work in that regard. My previous book it's titled Emancipation's Diaspora, and it's about the movement of formerly enslaved people into the upper Midwest during the Civil War as a part of their effort to escape slavery and to build new communities in freedom. And in doing that project, I learned a great deal about Iowa's historic Black population and the communities Black Iowans have built, and the fraternal halls and the schools and all the community institutions that are a rich part of Iowa history, as well as the very long struggle of Black Iowans for civil rights. So I do write extensively about that in that book, Emancipation's Diaspora, which is a 19th century history. It talks about Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. And it's important to understand that Black Iowans have been here since the beginning and are a critical part of the history of the territory and the state. I've also done work on what's called the Black Convention movement, or Colored Convention movement, as people referred to it at the time. In the 19th century, there was a national effort by Black communities to organize at the grassroots level, to set strategies, to come together collectively, talk about how to fight for civil rights. And as it turns out, Iowa had the largest number of conventions that met in the 19th century of any northern state. Again, a part of our history that we haven't really reckoned with, but this was a very important movement, and we see Black communities across the state organizing to set goals and strategies and come together around the issue of how to get our children into the public schools, how to get them into colleges, how to have a political voice, how to register to vote, etc. So that's just some of the work I've been lucky enough to be involved in.
Well, I hope I can have you back on Reading with Rochelle to talk about that effort, because I'm very fascinated by the colored conventions as well. So,
I will be glad to talk about that.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being on Reading with Rochelle. And I hope everyone will go out and buy your book, A Medicine, Science, and Making Race in Civil War America by Dr. Leslie Schwalm. Thank you.
Thank you.